Thank you, everyone, for joining Just Zero for this special 30-minute virtual interview on PFAS and our waste with Peers Director of Science Policy, Dr. Kyla Bennett. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today for a special 30-minute virtual interview about PFAS and our waste. My name is Laura Orlando. I am Senior Scientist at Just Zero. For anyone who's unfamiliar with us, Just Zero is a national environmental nonprofit. We work with communities, policymakers, and everybody in between to implement just and equitable solutions to climate damaging and toxic waste disposal practices. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. Kyla Bennett, Director of Science Policy at Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. Today, we'll be discussing PFAS, also called forever chemicals, in our waste, why they're a problem, and what we can do about them. Just a quick reminder that this event is being recorded. Throughout the interview, we will be sharing links with you in the chat that relate to the topics we'll be discussing. Now, before we begin, I'm going to hand it over to Kyla to introduce herself.
Thanks so much, Laura, and thank you so much for having me here, Just Zero. As Laura said, my name is Kyla Bennett. I am Peers Science Policy Director. That stands for Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, and PEER is basically a whistleblower organization. We support and defend local, state, and federal employees who work in the environmental arena. And PEER started getting involved in PFAS back in 2006, a long time ago, but really started getting into it on a daily basis starting in 2018. And we have gone down the PFAS rabbit hole, and we're actually suing EPA over PFAS, and it's about 80% of my job right now.
Wow. Well, I can't wait to hear more. Thanks for joining us today. We're excited to have you and learn more about what you and PEER are doing. Well, let's dive into our first question.
Sure.
To get us started, can you share with everybody what PFAS are and why they're a problem?
Sure. PFAS are a very, very large family of chemical compounds. We don't even know how many there are. EPA says there are roughly 14,000 of them. Other international groups think that there may be millions of them. But the one thing that this family of compounds has in common are a backbone of carbon-fluorine atoms that are bonded together. And that bond between the carbon atom and the fluorine atom is so strong. It's one of the strongest bonds known in organic chemistry. It's very, very difficult to break, which is why PFAS have received this nickname of forever chemicals, because they just don't readily break down. They can last for decades, if not hundreds of years. So that's one of the biggest common denominators of all of these chemicals, is that they're incredibly persistent. And unfortunately, not only are they persistent, but they cause really awful health impacts. Immune problems, they can make vaccines not work well, they can give you heart problems, they can make you obese, developmental problems, and some of them have been linked to cancer. The two most legacy PFAS, the ones we know the most about, PFOA and PFOS, have both been linked to cancer. PFOA is a human carcinogen, PFOS is a likely carcinogen. So they're really, really nasty chemicals.
Are they found naturally in the environment?
They are not. And I'm usually very careful when I say something is human-made. In this case, these were definitely man-made. They were made by some male scientists back in the 1930s, working for one of the chemical companies. They were made accidentally. But PFAS are really useful because they provide water resistance, stain resistance, oil resistance. So they're ubiquitous, unfortunately, in consumer products right now. And they are used in so many consumer products: your couches, your carpets, clothing, dental floss, nonstick pans, firefighting foam, firefighting turnout gear. They're on soccer balls and guitar strings and sails that you sail with on a
Wow.
sailboat. I mean,
Right.
they're just everywhere.
Right. Um, while they become a hot topic in recent years, what really hasn't been discussed is how landfills and wastewater treatment plants are major sources of PFAS pollution. You talked about consumer products, but there are other sources of PFAS pollution. Can you tell us how PFAS and our waste are connected?
Sure. It's a huge problem. What happens is when you use, well, for the consumer product part of it, when you use a consumer product that has PFAS in it, for example, if you use makeup that has PFAS and then at night before you go to bed and you wash your face, that makeup will go down the drain. And if you're in a septic system, like I am, it'll go into your septic system, get into the soil and the groundwater. But if you're on a sewer, which a lot of people are, that water, including that PFAS, will get taken to a wastewater treatment plant. And these wastewater treatment plants take both municipal waste, like from households, but they also can take industrial waste. And because PFAS are used in industry so frequently, there are very, very vast amounts of this PFAS coming out, being discharged into wastewater treatment plants from industry, and then also from residential homes. And unfortunately, these wastewater treatment plants were not designed to remove PFAS from the waste stream. Indeed, studies have shown that the amount of PFAS in the influent, in other words, the stuff coming into the wastewater treatment plant, the amount of PFAS in the influent is less than the amount in the effluent. So actually more PFAS are being created during the treatment of wastewater treatment. And then that discharge goes out into rivers or wherever. If you take consumer products or even or the wastewater treatment, anything sludge from there and put it in a landfill, the PFAS will come down through precipitation, get into the leachate, which we also call garbage juice. And then that leachate is taken to a wastewater treatment plant where it's just continually cycled throughout the environment. So EPA suggests there are 3 ways we can safely dispose of PFAS waste. One is incineration, doesn't always work. You have to have super high temperatures before it'll destroy a lot of the PFAS. So a lot of PFAS will become airborne and they can travel 150 kilometers downwind and then settle. If you put them in a wastewater treatment plant, as I've said, you create more. And then if you inject them in deep water wells, that's one way to do it, but then that can also escape and get into the soil and groundwater. So there's no good way to get rid of this stuff.
That's why they're called forever chemicals, right? The wastewater treatment plant sounds to me like a giant chemistry set. So, the precursors, the building blocks for PFAS, those carbon, fluorine atoms linked together once they're in the wastewater treatment plant, and you get more coming out than going in. Did I have that right?
You do have that right. And not only that, but remember that biosolids, that's the solid part of waste. So when you have stuff coming out of the wastewater treatment plant after it's gone through treatment, remember it's got a ton of PFAS in it, lots and lots of PFAS. What they do is they dry that stuff and the liquid comes off and they take the remaining solids and they call those biosolids, which is just a euphemism for sewage waste. And they spread that on farms as fertilizer. It's a really good fertilizer because human waste and animal waste are good fertilizers for growing crops. But in this particular case, when you take those biosolids and put them on crops, the PFAS will get into the soil, into the vegetation, into the water, and it can actually kill farm animals that are eating that vegetation or get into the milk or the meat of the animals that are then consumed by humans.
So there are 2 things that come out of a wastewater treatment plant: the effluent, the liquid, the treated wastewater, which goes into some receiving body of water. Like in Boston, it goes into the Atlantic Ocean. Um, and the unwanted and then unwanted byproduct, the sewage sludge,
Yep.
this so-called biosolids. And you could kind of call the sludge a treatment byproduct? Because some of the PFAS, and remember, there are thousands of them. You told us there are thousands or maybe millions, make their way to the sewage sludge. They're kind of captured by the sludge, and not just PFAS, but a lot of other chemical contaminants make their way to the sewage sludge. And then there's no treatment for the sludge. It's a byproduct. And so even if you drying it doesn't get rid of the PFAS. And then that goes wherever the sludge goes, in the landfill, or the greatest nightmare is on a farm or a ranch.
Right. And conventional farms typically use biosolids as fertilizer because it's cheap. It's really, really cheap. Organic farms are not allowed to use biosolids. So one of the ways as a consumer that you can reduce your own exposure to PFAS is to try to buy organic fruits and vegetables and milk and meat. And I know that sounds like I'm coming from a privileged place because not everybody can afford organic, but keep in mind that Target and Walmart and Trader Joe's and Aldi's have some pretty cheap organic options. So it is possible for almost anybody in this country to get organic. And if you can, you should try.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe we should stop putting sewage sludge on farmland.
Absolutely. And
Right.
in fact, the state of Maine is the only state in the country that has banned the land application of biosolids to farmland because they've had so many farms become contaminated. Actually, Pure and is suing, along with some other nonprofits. We are suing EPA to try to get them to start regulating and putting limits on the amount of PFAS that can be in biosolids that are land applied.
Because there are always high concentrations in the sewage sludge. Is that right?
That is right. Absolutely. Yep.
Right. In its federal policy since the 1990s, EPA policy to allow this spreading of what we now know is PFAS contaminated sewage sludge on land, on farms and ranches, and bagging it, and gardeners buy it. Is that right?
That is right. And
Mhm.
it's really unfortunate because EPA has what they call this beneficial reuse program where they try to help industry get rid of their toxic waste. And biosolids is one of those instances. It's like, where does it go if it doesn't get land applied? Same thing with shredded tires or fly ash or fluoride. There are all these toxic byproducts out there that EPA has tried really hard to find a use for, and biosolids is one of them, and it's really a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, clearly waste is a big factor in the PFAS catastrophe. It's why organizations and groups like Peer and Just Zero and some states, you mentioned Maine, are working to address PFAS in our waste. Can you give us some examples about what they're doing, and, what are some of the solutions to this?
So there's no good short-term solution. There is a good long-term solution, which I'll get to in a minute. But what Maine has been, the reason Maine has been able to ban the land application of biosolids is because they're a fairly large state with a low population, at least for the East Coast. So what they've done is they've banned waste from other states into their landfills, and they've been able to landfill their biosolids. But they're going to run out of space in their landfills soon. So as far as I'm concerned, the only long-term solution to this problem is for EPA, the federal agency responsible for all of these chemicals and this waste, to define PFAS really broadly, regulate them as a class. Right now, EPA is regulating them on an individual basis, and they regulate now 6 in water. Now, remember, there's 14,000 according to EPA. So regulating 6 is literally a drop in the bucket. So they need to define them broadly, regulate them as a class, and ban all non-essential uses. And once that happens, there won't be PFAS in the biosolids, and maybe you can land apply it. Doesn't mean that there won't be other awful things in there, but at least for PFAS, it won't go in there. So that is in my mind, the only long-term solution we have is to get it out of our products, get it out of our manufacturing plants, and then it will no longer be in the biosolids.
Yeah, Just Zero is working on uh, helping to close landfills, prevent their expansion, and close them when we can. By, some of the things that we do is keep bottles and cans, keep cardboard, keep food waste out of landfills. Because when you can close a landfill, there is markedly less landfill leachate. That garbage juice drops almost to zero when you close the landfill and cap it. So that's one way we can prevent literally millions and millions and millions of gallons of this PFAS contaminated landfill leachate from going to our sewer systems.
Yeah.
By recycling our cans and bottles, and it's pretty low hanging fruit. We need to pass those bottle bills. We need to get food scraps out of landfills and make real compost out of them.
I agree. And one of the things that we haven't talked about yet is some of those plastic containers that are ending up in landfills or even being recycled are themselves contaminated with PFAS, because there's a company in the United States that actually will take these #2 plastics, the HDPE plastic bottles, which, a lot of your shampoos, your cleaners, a lot of food is in it. And they deliberately fluorinate these containers to make them leak proof. And during that fluorination process, a number of PFAS are formed, very high levels. We're talking part per billion levels, and PFAS is regulated in parts per trillion.
So that's 1,000 times greater. The
Yep,
difference between a
exactly.
part per billion and a part per trillion is 1,000 times greater.
Right. So the PFAS will actually get formed when they fluorinate these containers. And then when you put products in it, like shampoo or food or household cleaner or fuel, the PFAS can leach into not only the products, but it also stays in the plastic. And then when you recycle the #2, because that's one of the two plastics that we tend to recycle, numbers 1 and 2, it can contaminate the recycling stream. So all that plastic now has PFAS in it. Or if you take that #2 container that's been fluorinated and throw it in the landfill, that PFAS is going to leach out into the garbage juice. So that's
Another great reason to back off on the use of plastics.
100%.
And you recently co-wrote a paper that talked about PFAS and pesticides and its link to these fluorinated containers.
Yeah.
So how big of a problem are PFAS and pesticides?
Huge. It's a huge problem. And in fact, it's kind of a funny story, because back in 2019, I tested my own town's water thinking it would be clean. I was using it as a control, and it wasn't clean. We had levels that exceeded the Massachusetts state limits. And I couldn't figure out why, because I live in a small suburban town. We don't have a Department of Defense facility. We don't have industry. We don't have a fire training facility. I was wondering where all this PFAS came from. And the only thing I could think of, because I'm located in southeastern Mass, we get sprayed all the time because we're ground zero for EEE, Eastern equine encephalitis, which is a very dangerous but rare mosquito-borne disease. And I was wondering if there was PFAS in the pesticides that they're spraying us with every year. And I asked DEP, they said no. So I didn't believe them. I tested it, and I found pretty high amounts of PFAS in the mosquito side.
Wow.
So that's what led EPA to discover that these plastic containers were leaching PFAS into these pesticide containers. But it's virtually every company that uses plastic, they use these fluorinated containers. And EPA shut down one company. They shut down the one company that makes Anvil 1010, that was spraying my town and others, and said, you can't do this anymore. But then they left all the others alone. So there are a lot of pesticides out there. When you go to Home Depot or Lowe's or Walmart or whatever and grab a bottle of pesticide off the shelf, if it's in a #2 plastic, I can pretty much guarantee that it's fluorinated and that you're going to be spraying PFAS everywhere.
And it's when we talk about solutions, it's right there. Stop fluorinating these containers, and you just break that PFAS bridge.
Exactly. And we are actually suing EPA to try to get that to happen right now.
Here is.
Yep, Pure and CEH, Center
Yep.
for Environmental Health. Yep.
Yep. Terrific. Well, you just shared what organizations are doing to address this crisis, but I'm sure a lot of people are wondering what they can do on an individual basis. Is there anything they can, individuals can do to reduce their exposure to PFAS? And do
Yeah.
you have any advice for how our audience can join the fight against PFAS pollution?
Yeah, absolutely. Two really good questions. I personally have managed to get my blood levels of PFAS down way below the national average. And the way I do that is number one, I try to eat organic as much as possible. I'm also vegan. Plants tend to have less PFAS in them than animals because PFAS will biomagnify through the food chain. So meat and dairy tend to have, and fish tend to have more.
So you mean they accumulate?
Yep, they
Yep.
accumulate.
Yep.
Yep, yep. So one thing to do is to be careful about what you eat, but also be careful about the products you buy. And Green Science Policy Institute has this great website called PFAS Central, and they have a list of PFAS-free products, consumer products. So like the rain gear that I bought, my raincoat and my rain pants, because I hike a lot, PFAS-free. My hiking boots, PFAS-free. There's a list of insect repellent or sunscreen that's PFAS free. So unfortunately, it's really difficult to pick up a label and say, is there PFAS in here or not? It's hard for consumers to tell. But if you go to the list that Green Science Policy has, you can get some products that are PFAS free there. Also places like IKEA. IKEA has vowed not to have any PFAS in any of their products. So when you go shop there, you know that you're not getting PFAS. Home Depot and Lowe's supposedly got PFAS out of their carpets that are sold in their stores. So stores are starting to come around, but the best thing that you can do as a consumer is to ask questions and to be educated. So when you contact either by email or calling their customer support line and saying, hey, do you have PFAS in your products? You need to be careful because they will greenwash things and say, oh, we don't have any PFOA in our products, or we don't have any
Good
PFOS.
point.
And that's just one or two of the tens of thousands of PFAS that are out there. So you have to ask them, do you have any PFAS, any fluorinated chemistry in your products? That's the question to ask. So you can be your own advocate. It's kind of a pain in the neck, but it's worth it because you really, really do not want to get a lot of PFAS in your blood. 99% of Americans have PFAS in their blood. A lot of us have so much that we need to get checked every 6 months to a year for certain illnesses that are associated with these PFAS.
You can also contact your local water authority to find out. There are now federal rules around the 6 PFAS you mentioned.
Yep.
There are what are called maximum contaminant levels, the MCLs. They exist for 6 of them. And so for people on public water systems, you can check with your municipality or the water department to see where the water department stands on that. And private wells are not part of the Safe Drinking Water Act, the rules and regulations around drinking water. So unfortunately, people in rural areas on private, who have private wells have to test their own water. And there are systems, they're not cheap, but there are systems that can help filter a lot of PFAS out of the drinking water. And I think Maine has some really good information about that
Yeah,
on
I
their
would also,
DEP's website.
yep, I would also suggest for anybody who, like my town now does have a town-wide filtration system up, but we're one of the few towns in Massachusetts that does. If you go to the NSF website, the National Sanitation Foundation, they actually have a list of filters that are third-party certified to remove PFAS. And I would urge people, in some cases, like for people with private wells, it's actually cheaper to just buy a filter than it is to test your water for PFAS because it's expensive, unfortunately, right now. So get a filter, put it under your kitchen sink or get a countertop one, feed it to your cats, your dogs, make ice with it, make coffee with it. When you're cooking things like pasta that absorbs water, use PFAS-free water. And one thing to keep in mind is bottled water is not necessarily safe. So don't think that going to the store and buying, some bottled water, particularly in plastic bottles, is a good idea because a lot of the bottled water has PFAS in it.
That's a great point. And I want folks to take in something you said earlier, you can reduce the amount of PFAS in your blood, in your body. You can. And, 99% of Americans have PFAS in their bodies, but the concentrations can be reduced when we pay attention. Unfortunately, it's on us. But groups like PEER are pushing the federal government to take action. But we can reduce that PFAS in our bodies. It's really an important point. With the time we have left, can you tell us a little bit more about the lawsuit you referred to related to PFAS contaminated sewage sludge?
Yes, sure. We were, as I said at the beginning of this, Pure we're basically a service organization. So we don't sit around a table and decide what we're going to work on over the next 5 years. We wait for our clients, who are local, state, and federal employees, to bring us cases. And we were contacted by an environmental investigator in Johnson County, Texas. This is deep red, rural Texas. And she was very alarmed because she had some farmers who she calls them her victims. They were organic farmers, and the farm across the street spread these biosolids all over his farm. And the smell was awful, and they started having all these fish kills. Their catfish all died. Their cows started dying. Their horses were dying. Their dogs were getting sick. They were getting sick. So Johnson County spent a lot of money with PEER, working with PEER to test the soil, the water, the dead animals, the fish, and we found massive amounts of PFAS. As an example, in one of the stillborn calf livers, there was 610,000 parts per trillion of just PFOS, one of the most dangerous PFAS. It would
I want
be
to remind people that the drinking water standard is 4.
and
So
the
4
goal
parts per
0
trillion, and the goal is 0. And you all found 600,000.
and 10
Wow.
610,000. Yep. So we are suing EPA. Our clients are these farming families. Johnson County has joined the lawsuit. A lot of the counties down there in Texas are working really hard to stop this because they're afraid of what it's doing to their farms. We've also been joined by the Maine Organic Farming and Gardening Association and the Potomac River Keepers. So we have a group of people from 3 different states, Texas, Maine, and Maryland, all coming together to say to EPA, you have to stop allowing this. So what we are asking EPA to do in this lawsuit is to actually develop standards where they say, if there's X amount of PFOA in these biosolids, you cannot land apply them. Right now, in biosolids, the only thing that EPA regulates are 9 metals. They have not added a chemical constituent that they regulate in biosolids since the 1990s. So they're way behind. And people keep saying, oh, PFAS is an emerging contaminant. It's really not. It's been around since the 1930s. EPA has known for at least 25 years how bad these things are. So it's time for them to start putting some limits on these biosolids. And the problem all boils down to, what are we going to do with all of these biosolids? To me, again, the only answer is for EPA to regulate PFAS as a class and ban all non-essential uses. And are there essential uses? Yeah, maybe. There are some medicines that are PFAS. Prozac, Paxlovid, the medicine that we use to combat COVID, that's a PFAS. Flonase, which is an allergy medicine that you squirt up your nose. Those are all PFAS. Are they necessary? Essential? Maybe pharmaceutical companies could find some way to do this without the PFAS. But for now, we don't need it in our dental floss or our guitar strings. I mean, or our makeup. I'd rather have my mascara run than contaminate the world and give everyone cancer.
So turn off the spigot. Let's stop producing PFAS. Let's stop allowing it in our consumer products. If they're made abroad and shipped here, they should be PFAS free.
Yep.
Let's work on closing landfills, not expanding them. Let's stop the land application of sewage sludge because we know now it is all PFAS contaminated.
Yep.
Well, this has been terrific. I really appreciate your sharing your work with us and the work that Peer is doing. And that's all the time we have today. But special thanks to you, Kyla.
Thank,
And thank you to everyone who tuned in. Let's get to work.
thank you for having me. And thank you everyone who's watching.
All right. Bye-bye.